Hi guys, welcome to Lizzie Dean Makes. Today I'm doing something a bit different. I am filming a mini-series on how to get started teaching yourself to write code, specifically web development. I've explained why in previous videos, so if you haven't seen those yet, perhaps best to go to the beginning of this mini-series and start from there. I want to cover in this video some information about HTML forms and how they relate to the HTTP protocol. So if you want to create a web page on your website that contains a form, the first thing that you obviously need to do is to create an HTML document for that page that contains your form. So there is an HTML element of angle brackets form, and within that form you would have various different input fields where people would fill in the data, and then you might have a submit button at the bottom so that once they've filled in all the data they can submit it, and it will then use the HTTP protocol to send their information to a server to then be processed and handled, perhaps stored to a database, perhaps sent in an email, whatever the appropriate action is. So when you create your HTML form element, in the form element you will have the ability to define a method. Now the HTML method refers to the HTTP verbs, so you could potentially set up your form to use the HTTP GET method so that when it gets submitted, it gets submitted as a GET request. And you would also want to include in there the URL, the link to where that gets submitted to when it gets submitted. So if you're doing a GET request, the GET part says that it will add a question mark and name value pairs of the input names and values from your form to the end of the URL that you've specified. So you're going to set up a method and an action. So the method is which HTTP verb, and the action is the URL it's going to send it off to. And that URL is without the question mark blah blah blah, because the form is going to create those for you. So you set that up in the top of the form element at the beginning of your form. Then within your form you want to add the input elements that you require for your HTML form. So HTML4 had some pretty standard input elements. So you could have a input of type text, where you could type in some text, or you could have an input type of checkbox. So you could tick a checkbox and it would be checked, or it wouldn't be checked, which is a boolean, true or false. Or you could have some radio buttons where you could choose from some options, but you could only choose one at a time, so it was mutually exclusive. So you might have yes or no, and if you choose yes, then no is automatically not selected. Whereas with a checkbox you could perhaps have lots of checkboxes, lots of different options, and you could check a variety of those. So you could potentially check all of them, or you could check a couple of them, or you could check none of them, and they would all be valid combinations. Whereas with the radio checkbox you can only ever choose one of those options. Or you could have a select input type, and a select input type is essentially a drop down where you click on the little down arrow at the side and it gives you a list of options to choose from. And a standard, you can generally only choose one option from a select drop down, although there are various things that you can do with key presses. But those were the sort of standard HTML input types up until HTML5. So the introduction of HTML5 gave some new input types. Essentially what these input types added to the party was the ability to do some basic input type validation on the text that was entered. So for example, if you had an input type email in HTML5, it will check to see whether or not there is an @ sign in the data that's been input into that text box. And it will make sure that it is therefore a valid email syntax that they've typed in. If you put that it's a type password, it will automatically put stars instead of the actual characters so that it's hidden from someone looking over their shoulder. These are various sort of new input types that have been added in HTML5. So if your browser supports HTML5, those features will be shown and they will act accordingly. So if you have an input type email and you're in a modern browser and you type in something that's not an email and try and submit the form, it will create a sort of red border around the outside of that email input type, and it will give a message saying you haven't put in a correct email because there's no @ and that's sort of a basic form validation that HTML5 automatically offers. If someone is accessing it on an older browser, and the reason that someone might be using an older browser is perhaps if they're at work, and if their work is particularly secured and locked down and they don't let people upgrade their browsers and so they're forcing them to be on a certain version, or if the organisation is maybe a public body who've got no money and so they have never bothered to give them new computers, so they've got really old ones running on a really old operating system and they can only use really old browsers, they wouldn't automatically get those new HTML5 features supported in the browser that they're using. So then comes into play something which is known as graceful degradation. So if you type in graceful degradation, it will explain a bit about how to make a website that is cross-compatible with different browsers, but in such a way that people who are on an old browser that doesn't support these things don't get any new features, but they still get a good enough experience. So cross-browser compatibility is something that is definitely worth looking into more, particularly when it comes to CSS and JavaScript as well, that new features that have been made available for later versions and on modern browsers might not be available to older browsers, or things that are available on Chrome, which is a WebKit based browser, may not be available on Firefox, or things that are available on Chrome might not necessarily be available on IE, Internet Explorer. So cross-browser compatibility is something definitely to look into, as is the concept of graceful degradation for how to handle older browsers and making sure that they have a sufficient level of functionality available to them on their old browser, but maybe that there are certain features which are available to modern browsers which they just don't get if they're on an older browser. So once you've chosen your input types and added them in, the submit button will then submit the parameters, the name value pairs of data that's been filled in the form, to the action URL using the method HTTP verb that you've specified at the top of your form element. So if you specified post, it will send them in the body of the HTTP post request. The script or whatever that's going on your server at that URL location will execute those parameters and things, and it will either decide that it's okay, it can save these to the database, or it can send these in an email, or it might do some additional validation on the things that have been input and say no, this is not okay, and send it back. So you might get an HTTP 200 okay back from the server, or you might get another message coming back from the server telling you what has happened with the data that you've submitted. So that's the HTTP response. Now, if you're using a standard HTTP form and you do a GET request, it will actually take you to that script as the new page that launches in the browser. If you are using JavaScript, you can actually put a function so that you have a function that executes when that form is submitted. And rather than using HTML's built-in method for submitting forms via GET or POST, you can actually handle that using AJAX in your JavaScript, and you can then keep them on the page and display the appropriate response to them, or take them to the next thing that they need to do after they've submitted that form, depending on what the outcome was from the server. The other thing to bear in mind is that while HTML5 has some built-in validation on your form, you could also add some JavaScript that handles validation of your form yourself, particularly if you are looking at several fields that are dependent on one another. So for example, if they select something from a drop down at the top of the form, it might completely change the input fields that are available for them to fill in further down, depending on which option they choose from that drop down. You could also have some validation arguments on a certain thing. So for example, if they've got to put their age and they put in an age that is not allowed to see this content, then you might need to send them something back saying, I'm sorry, but you can't go any further because you're not old enough yet. Something like that. So you might want to perform your own JavaScript validation before you even attempt to send the form data off to the server using HTTP. One big reason for this is that there are various methods of hacking and sort of bad stuff that can happen using HTML forms that's trying to send information off to the server, and it's trying to sneak in under the radar and do bad things. So examples of this might be SQL injection or cross-site scripting, and so you want to try and lock down anything that the end user gets to input. You want to always make sure that what they input is what they're allowed to input and nothing else. So you don't want to allow them to type in some JavaScript into an input field on your form and submit it, because then they might execute that JavaScript and do something that they're not supposed to do. You don't want them to be able to add any code into that box that's going to say speak to your database that you're trying to submit this form to on the server. So both your server-side scripting code that handles that data when it receives it needs to do its validation to make sure that nothing malicious has been sent to it, but you should also make sure nothing malicious has been put in the form before you even send it to the server, and that is client-side validation on inputs. So those are some sort of key thoughts about HTML forms and HTTP and how they all tie together. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up and watch the rest of this mini series on coding to get more information. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.